the stability of the economy as a whole.
The ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro.
Alexa, how is the world doing?
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome back to the Amundi World Investment Forum 2023. Welcome back to all of you joining us here in the auditorium in Paris, and also to everyone who is joining us via the live stream this morning. I'm Ray Dundas, I'm your moderator, and it's with great pleasure that I now welcome the Merton H. Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business, and recipient of the 2022 Nobel Prize in Economics for his research in banks and financial crises, Professor Douglas Diamond.
It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today. As the last video sort of showed, financial stability is again in question. The world spent a lot of time after the 2007-9 crisis trying to fix it up, as Professor Dodd said there, trying to fix it up so it never happened again. It didn't seem to work. And world interest rate, particularly real interest rate increases in the recent period, have put interest rate risk as a source of financial stability back in our minds. Basically for the first time since the savings and loan crisis in the United States back in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So I'm going to talk today about two things. One, the research that I did back in the 1970s and 80s about what banks really should be doing, how they should be structured, how banks can add some value relative to even very informationally efficient financial markets, and what that view of the world, the right way to run banking, to actually do something useful for society, what that has to say about the stuff that's been happening this year in 2023. I'll talk a bit about the Silicon Valley Bank and how that is an interesting predictor of what's going to happen in the near future in the financial system. So basically, the takeaway is going to be that the thing that I learned is that financial supervision in the United States is much less effective than I would have hoped, and I'll try to highlight in the view of like what banks are supposed to do, like what's the fairly easy role that supervisors are assigned, and how supervisors in the US and I believe in other countries around the world have made a fundamental mistake by thinking about the last crisis instead of just thinking about history, say, over the last 200 years. So as I said, my research that the Nobel Committee acknowledged was basically trying to answer the question, what do banks do, how should they do it, and what's the best possible, actually that's not quite what I do. What I do is say there's certain tasks, and I'll give you two tasks, that would be useful for the financial system to do, and that the financial markets, just trading efficiently in stock markets and bond markets, can't do in the best possible way. So if the financial market can't do something, what sort of invisible hand of capitalism has a financial intermediary, a financial institution do this task? And then what are the best incentive contracts? What are the best possible contracts for that financial intermediary to do? So what I do is give it a task, say, what's the best contract for anyone to do it, any set of people to do it, with capital and labor and things like that. And then for the contract solution, the answer tends to be, or the answer turned out to be for the two models I'll talk about, here's a structure that delivers more or less what banks or non-bank financial institutions do. And then if we understand, here's the question we're trying to answer, here's the best answer, it looks like a bank, that gives you a theory of banking, a theory of financial intermediation, which you can then take that theory, which is a very high-level model where you can use the world's real-time data to quickly feed it through the model without any great parameters, just say, uh-oh, this is what's going on. This looks a lot like what happened in 1927, say, or 1931. For this model, it's going to give you a particular prediction of what might happen, a sort of particular set of thoughts about what things like governments or central banks could do in response. So in modern systems, it's not just, you don't have to have payments as one of your outcomes with the things you can do with the accounts, like you can do with a checking account or a current account. It could be any institution. So the answer is going to turn out to be that short-term debt is very, very important. So I have a little phrase that when I give slides, I always put on a slide by itself, is that financial crises are everywhere and always about the problems of short-term debt. Not about money, but about short-term debt. So the role of banks in the views that I have could be an institution like Lehman Brothers, which didn't really have any cash in its vault, but it did have a lot of short-term debt, and that was the reason that Lehman Brothers was the epicenter for the 2008 crisis. Okay, so very, very quickly, it's a little hard to talk about, one's life work in 7 minutes, but I'll tell you about two papers that the Nobel Committee acknowledged. The first one's called Financial Intermediation and Delegated Monitoring. So what that paper is, what that model is about, these are theories. Full disclosure, I'm not an empiricist. I don't estimate any parameters. So why would you ever ask a theorist about something practical? I don't know, but you did. So basically the reason that asking a theorist is reasonable is that these theories are high-level ways of organizing one's thoughts, which central bankers, people in the financial community, individuals can use to make real-time decisions quickly. And it turned out that the data that came out after these models were developed wasn't wildly different, and it was sort of the paradigm that was used by people like the Federal Reserve in 2008, when people were thinking about responding to the East Asia financial crisis in the late 1990s. These models were useful. So the first one, financial intermediation and delegated monitoring. This is about how do we allow, say, small and medium businesses or startups that have some collateral, but people don't know much about them. How do we allow those firms to get access to capital? And the reason that they might have a problem getting access to capital is they need something like what I'll call monitoring. They need someone to make sure they're not actually siphoning all the money off to their brother-in-law. They got to make sure that they're actually somewhat competent. They could be, make sure that their accounting systems are good, that they know how to deliver at least a little bit of the product they deliver. It's not some kind of a fake blood test that doesn't actually work. So the question is, how do you do this? But this monitoring, or making sure the blood tests aren't fake, is something you wouldn't want each and every member of the financial market who put 10,000 euros of their money into this firm. You wouldn't want each of them to do it. You want to sort of hire somebody to keep track of the borrower to make sure they're on the straight and narrow. Okay, so this makes, I'm going to be a little careful since I'm on LinkedIn. So these are colloquialisms, so I don't want to be quoted directly on this. But basically, let's call the borrower crook number one. Okay, because you really don't trust them because they might be stealing the money and giving it to their brother-in-law or sister-in-law, as the case may be. We should be very modern here. You could steal money. It's not. It tends to be men, though, it turns out, who steal this money. Okay, so now you've got crook number one. You don't trust him, so you have to monitor them. But you don't want everybody to monitor them. So I'm going to hire somebody to monitor the borrower. Okay, let's call the person you've hired to monitor the borrower crook number two. So you hire one crook to monitor another crook. That doesn't sound like a great setup It's great for the crook number 1 and crook number 2 if you don't do anything else, because they can split the proceeds that they're stealing from you. So how do you get crook number 2 to behave well? So, you can monitor crook number 2. Well, who's going to monitor crook number 2? Well, you get crook number 3. Now, this is not going to work. Okay, so now pretty soon we have lots of crooks monitoring each other. We may as well just let the first one steal the whole thing. Okay, so now we're going to say, okay, we're not going to monitor either crook number 1 or crook number 2, but if crook number 2, we're going to call that person the banker, no offense to the people in the room here. So the banker is going to say, we're not going to monitor you, but if you don't pay us the amount you promised us, you're fired, and maybe we can actually, claw back some bonuses, or I don't know, take away pictures of your children or things like that are highly valuable to you. Okay, so basically, why would that work? So look, if the borrower number 1, if the borrower can't pay you, the original crook can't pay you, then that person can't pay crook number 2, the banker, who can't pay you, so that's not going to work. But how can we do this? So take away from this, that's the assumptions of the model. What does the model deliver? Banks, crook number 2, has to monitor lots of borrowers. They have to diversify. Diversification's like the only free lunch there is in finance. So we have to get them to monitor and then diversify and then issue debt. And then the bank fails if they don't pay their debt. So that's a theory of how delegated monitoring leads to debt. And what do you want the bank to have? Safe debt with lots of leverage. Well, that doesn't sound possible, but diversification does allow that. But you're still going to be left with systematic risk in the economy. So the second takeaway is banks, crook number 2, banks who are well diversified, big, shouldn't bear much interest rate risk if they don't have to. They have to bear a little, but they shouldn't load up on interest rate risk. And that in diversification will keep them safe. So who makes sure they diversify and keep their interest rate risk down? Supervisors. Supervisors don't monitor. They don't keep track of whether the borrower is a crook or not. They just keep track of, did the bank diversify? Did the bank keep its interest rate risk down? Supervisors, that's an easy task. And we can hire, it's like an accountant. You give an easy task, you say, okay, they followed the standards. Okay, that's what supervisors are supposed to do. That's what they didn't do in Silicon Valley, as it turns out. So then the second paper is paper with Phil Divig, the Diamond-Divig model, bank runs deposit insurance and liquidity. And then says what that is about is the banks issue short-term liquid claims, deposits, to finance long-term illiquid loans. Okay, and illiquid just means you can't sell it for what it's worth, the present value of what it's worth. So how do you do that? Well, the simplest way to do that is you say, okay, not everybody's going to need their money at the same time. I give that small fraction of the people who need their money early, take it out today for liquidity purposes, more than I could give if I had to give it to everybody. Okay, so that's the feature. Liquidity creation is that you give those people who withdraw more than you could give if everybody withdrew. Okay, that's the feature. What's the bug? If everybody withdraws, you can't do it by definition. You can't give everybody, like there's something in the US called Lake Wobegon. It's a place where everybody is above average. Not everybody can be above average. So just say not everybody can get a higher than average rate of return early if you got illiquid assets. So that basically once you are creating liquidity, you're doing something good when there's not a run. But the very task that you're doing, which is a good thing, leaves you subject to runs. So the fundamental structure of banks in creating liquidity leaves them subject to runs. Okay, to make this work, you need to have another type of diversification, diversified funding sources. That means two things. Not everybody needs their money at the same time. That one's obvious. And in the modern version, not everybody's on the same social network, which means they don't all see the same rumors that their impending doom is coming tomorrow. Okay, and then the trouble with the same social network is if everybody says that everybody else is going to take their money out, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But imagine that there's like a headline, bank run today, story on page 2. And you turn to page 2 and it says, tomorrow is the Chicago Marathon, sponsored by the Bank of America. Who is the sponsor? And it is called the bank run. But if everybody reads page 1 and page 2 and knows that everybody else sees that, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if only 2% of the people read this newspaper, they're going to say, my God, 2% of the people are going to pull their money out. So I don't care if 2% of their people pull their money out. So if everybody knows that only 2% of the people see that rumor, there won't be a run even by those 2% if they really think it through. Because if the rest of those 2% pulled it out, it wouldn't kill the bank. If the bank isn't going to die, don't take your money out. So diversified funding sources means don't put them all in the same social network. So, well, what happened in the U.S. in March of 2023? There was a run on Silicon Valley. It was sort of a 1.5-day run. It was a 2-day run, but on the second day, it turns out when you ask your bank to wire money out, they have till the end of the day to do it. So 25, 30% of the deposits got pulled out on Thursday. Most of the rest tried to pull out on Friday, but they failed on Friday, and nobody got out on Friday, but they failed. And the runs spread to other banks, First Republic Bank, any bank that sort of looked a little bit like First Republic. And then over the weekend, after they failed on Friday, they correctly decided to insure 100% of the deposits, including the uninsured ones over $250,000. And then that stopped the run on other banks. So what were the problems in Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley was 94% uninsured deposits, almost all of which were checking accounts, current accounts. When the supervisors look for something called the net stable funding ratio, one of the sources of stable funds are checking accounts, no matter insured or uninsured. So they had stable funding, but they had a run nonetheless. That's wrong. They didn't have stable funding. If it's uninsured, the average checking account was between $10 and $100 million. They talk about it sort of takes you a couple of hours to change banks and things like that. Well, for $100 million, you would change banks if your bank's about to fail. The other thing about Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley had 55% of their securities in liquid assets, U.S. government agency securities, which the supervisors did not mark to market. So that was I'm going to stop here soon, that was the huge mistake they made. Okay, first thing is, for liquid assets, everybody can know when their value goes down. Everybody can see that their treasury securities go down. So the U.S. capital requirements, bank capital requirements the supervisors had for both hold to maturity and available for sale assets, these really liquid government-like securities, they could carry them at par, what they bought them at, essentially. And even though interest rates went up by 500 basis points, so these things were selling at like 80 cents on the dollar, they were insolvent. Supervisor said, if you just hold these to maturity, it's only a paper loss. Why was that wrong? Well, the funding costs, the deposit interest costs of Silicon Valley went up, so they were in fact insolvent. And when everybody found out, hey, they're insolvent, that's not Bank One Today's story on page 2. That is, these guys are insolvent. Even if everybody else leaves their money in the bank, you better get out. So when the Silicon Valley, VCs, Peter Thiel and things like that told everybody else on Twitter, these guys are insolvent, everybody's going to get out as fast as they can. This was the world's fastest bank run, both because these people are all connected electronically, but most importantly, because the news was not a rumor that they might be insolvent, it's the truth that they truly were insolvent. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is everybody sees bank runs and they say, oh my God, they're bank runs. You do not want depositors thinking about bank runs. You want them thinking about, we missed the Queen of England or something like that. That's a much better thought than thinking about bank. When you're thinking about bank runs, that's what happened the day after Lehman. So short-term debt crises occur because people think people can't roll over their maturing short-term debt. When they think that, they're right. It's like the self-fulfilling prophecy I just talked about. So where are we in the cycle of higher interest rates? So this is all about interest rate risk. There's no significant default risk on Silicon Valley. Where are we in this cycle? Well, we're early in the phases. I want you to think of Silicon Valley as the canary in the coal mine, the leading indicator, the real-time thing that real interest rates go up, value of collateral goes down. No matter what kind of lending you're doing, certainly if you're doing real estate lending, but what kind of lending you're doing, if real interest rates goes up, the solvency of borrowers goes down, which basically says the solvency of the banking system goes down. And we saw it in real time because it was in treasury securities, but it's true more generally. So now is the time for banks to raise capital, reduce dividends, to increase confidence in the system. Real interest rates have gone up. They may go up a little bit higher. I think, the U.S. world interest rates, the U.S. interest rates like in the low 1% real, up from like -2 real. Maybe it's got to go up another 1%. But we can see that the banking system as a whole needs more capital, and supervisors made a huge mistake by ignoring market prices, particularly for liquid assets. So I have some policy implications that I unfortunately don't have time to talk about for this, but basically if you're any bank supervisors in the world, supervisors, regulator, government officials, they don't like to look at the market. But when you're looking at liquid securities, if you ignore the market, you're ignoring 100% of the issue. And that's how we got into this problem, and we hope this doesn't continue to spread. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I invite you to come and join me down on the stage below to answer some questions. Thank you very much for that both informative and entertaining presentation keynote there. My first question is, as you know, the long period of low inflation and low interest rates has been described as secular stagnation due to low investment. Since the pandemic, there's been high interest rates, high inflation, and lower labour supply, yet productivity hasn't changed. So my question is secular stagnation over? Will we live with structurally higher interest rates from now on? You touched on it briefly, and higher real wages?
So I've actually never been a big believer in secular stagnation as something that just happens. I mean, we did have this period where there was sort of what Ben Bernanke called the global savings glut. There was more savings out there than there were demand for investments. And particularly a lot of households around the world wanted fairly safe investments, which tended to be like U.S. Treasury securities. It's pushing U.S. real interest rates down, which pushed world real interest rates down just because of the alternatives. So I sort of thought of this as is it cycle or is it trend? I sort of thought this was cycle, and that real interest rates were sort of too low for the long run in stability, and that basically once COVID hit and we had supply shocks on a period where we already had loose fiscal policy around the world, which was sort of stimulating things like the U.S. cut taxes during a boom. A lot of other countries were cutting taxes. We had loose fiscal policy. Then we got COVID, which cut supply, which would tend to increase prices. And then we had more loose fiscal policy. The demand was going up, which pushed inflation up. And in the previous period, we had low inflation, partly because the central banks had great credibility. The central banks lost about a quarter of their credibility. So now I think we have more inflation, which means higher real interest rates to slow down inflation expectations. But I actually think it's part of a cycle. I actually do not believe in this secular stagnation. It's just the future is looking bleak. I mean, I don't know. I tend to be pretty optimistic. So.
Assuming that occasional problems, which happen, such as Credit Suisse recently, are idiosyncratic, is the regime in place robust enough to deal with global spillovers and cross-border resolution of systematically important banks and thus ensure financial stability?
So we did many things around the world after 2008. So we did think about resolution and things like that. So cross-border resolution, I don't think we really fixed that one. Individual countries still like to ring-fence the assets of the subsidiaries of an institution that are local, and hope that the liabilities that their locals hold are partly bailed out by assets outside the country. So I don't think we fixed resolution. We did much better, within the Eurozone. They did much better. You all have done much better within the Eurozone. But cross-border, I don't think it's fixed. I think the problem is the solution to better stability is not just thinking about better resolution when banks fail, but have fewer of them fail. So I mentioned improving supervision and getting more market prices in there. So I was part of a group of scholars and central bankers called the Squam Lake Group who wrote some stuff proposing new regulations. We wrote it in 2008. A book came out in 2010, Squam Lake Report. And we proposed two things that didn't get in, that should have got in. The main thing that would have been different, say, for Credit Suisse, is we thought contingent capital, COCOs, like the AT1s that got written down, shouldn't convert at the point of insolvency. They should convert at the point of pretty good solvency. So if the bank capital gets below 10%, then some debt converts to equity to get it back up above 10%. You don't want banks getting down close to zero, because one, you have runs then once it's close to zero. Anybody thinks there's a run, they're right. And second, banks behave very badly when the equity's around zero. So if they just kept banks, if you want banks to have safe leverage and high leverage, the only way to do that is to keep recapitalizing along the way whenever you have a small loss. Waiting until you're broke, like they did with the Credit Suisse, it's too late. And then writing off the debt down to zero and leaving the equity with value provides absolutely horrendous incentives to the equity holders. So they did the wrong thing. The other thing that I think is essential is something we call bonus bonds. And the bankers in the room will not like these, but that's good for the society. So here with bonus bonds are anybody who works in a highly levered financial institution that gets more than 10% of their pay in bonuses has to put all of that bonus into a 5-year maturity junior bond on that bank. If the bank fails, they get nothing. So this is to put a constituency inside the bank for taking less risk. So one of the stories of Silicon Valley Bank is that the Silicon Valley Bank bonuses were paid on something called the net interest margin. So if they borrowed at 0% interest, which they did, and invested it like 100 basis points, they picking up a 1-point spread, they got a bigger bonus than if they just put the money in Federal Reserve reserves, interest on reserves, and they got 50 basis points or 25 basis points. So for 50 or 75 basis points, they blew up the bank. If they were going to lose 5 years bonuses, I predict they wouldn't have done that.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for, Professor Diamond. I know it's a topic that's on everyone's mind, and I'm sure we could talk for a lot more, but I want to thank you very much for being here with us today.
My pleasure.